This video is sponsored by Blinkist. Plane crashes have occurred over the years for many different reasons. Some of those accidents have paved the way for major changes in the industry. Others, such as the case with the accident we're discussing today, the problem can be found in what may appear to be the simplest of issues. Austrian Airlines Flight 901, when looked at in hindsight, can show how effective cockpit communication is key for the safe operation of a plane, and how failure to crosscheck can end in death. Before this video starts, I'd like to thank and tell you about today's sponsor, Blinkist. It's the new year, which can often make for the perfect opportunity to get learning on some new things, which is why for this video, I've teamed up with Blinkist. Blinkist is a fantastic learning tool that allows you to get all of the most important information out from over 5,500 non-fiction titles. The bite-sized content that Blinkist provides is perfect for that background learning experience. Have the app on whilst you're out on a run, for example. Or maybe you're like me, always behind the desk, always working. I love learning about science, even though I'm not that smart myself. And Blinkist has a variety of books that have kept me rather entertained whilst I've been sat here learning about plane crashes. I have had some of these on in the background whilst editing this very video. So I've teamed up with Blinkist so that my viewers can get the most out of this app too. If you use my link, blinkist.com/disasterbreakdown, you can find it at the top of the description or in the pinned comment below. You can start your 7-day trial today, and when you love it, you can be entitled to a 25% discount on a premium subscription. Not only that, but Blinkist Connect, which you get with my link, means you can enjoy 2 subscriptions for the price of 1. So don't miss out and come and check it out today. Thank you to Blinkist for sponsoring this video and paying my bills. With all of that said, let's get on with the video. The date was September 26, 1960. A plane operated by Austrian Airlines was making a routine trip between Vienna and Moscow, then capital of the Soviet Union. Airspace involving the Soviet Union was complicated and often restricted in many areas for many airlines. Moscow's Sheremetyevo Airport was one of only a few airports in the USSR that allowed Western air carriers. Flight 901 left Vienna that Monday afternoon and made a stopover in Warsaw in Poland. By the time it left Warsaw, the plane was carrying 37 passengers and crew. The plane itself was a British-built Vickers Viscount. It's a plane we've talked about before, but for a quick recap, the aircraft is often credited as being the world's first turboprop. The 4-engine plane was popular for its time, with well over 400 units built in the years between 1948 and 1963. The Viscount, though, has certainly had its fair share of incidents, but the plane is still remembered fondly by its former pilots and passengers. Many operators across the European continent flew the Viscount, and Austrian Airlines was among them. Up on the flight deck that day was 36-year-old Captain Erwin Wilfing and 39-year-old First Officer Ferdinand Friesleben. The plane had arrived in Warsaw 35 minutes late, but the departure for the second leg was pushed back further due to poor weather in Moscow. Their expected arrival time became 9:45 in the evening. To unpack this accident, we need to more closely examine the approach phase. When it comes to landing an aircraft, it's a delicate process, and pilots need to run through several checklists to configure their aircraft. To set the scene, in the case of Austrian 901, it was nighttime, and it must have been a busy evening at Moscow's Sheremetyevo Airport, as controllers would give Flight 901 2 sets of holding instructions, a normal procedure at larger, busier airports. At the time, Sheremetyevo had just one runway, this one. The descent into the airport was initiated whilst inside the holding patterns, and Flight 901 was given approach instructions for runway 07, the straight-in approach from the west. One part of the process of preparing any plane for landing is that the cockpit instruments should be reviewed and synchronized as needed, and one of the most important cockpit instruments is the altimeter. So for this video, we need to talk a bit more about the altimeter, and bear with me as we're about to go on a bit of a tangent. You already likely know what the altimeter does. It measures altitude. On the surface, altimeters are basic instruments and often easy to read, and even for non-pilots can be easily interpreted. In Western countries, we adopted the measurement of feet to be the standard when it comes to altitude in aviation. It was Russia, Warsaw Pact countries, and China, for example, that went with the metric meter. These countries have now since adopted the foot measurement. To get the actual altitude readings, altimeters are connected to the aircraft's static port. The changes in air pressure as a plane climbs or descends drives a barometer inside the instrument, the barometer being the device that measures air pressure. That information is then displayed on the altimeter. So this next part is where it gets a bit more confusing, and I'll do my best to keep this simple. Obviously, air pressure changes on the ground day to day, even hour by hour. So, every altimeter on a plane has some way to calibrate the altimeter setting to adhere to these changes at ground level. An adjustable barometric setting is usually displayed in a small window on or very near the altimeter itself. It is there to input what is called the barometric reference. Pilots before a flight, for example, would match the barometer with the outside pressure so that their altimeter should be calibrated to read the correct altitude for their departing airport. A lot of the time, altimeters may be calibrated with reference to sea level, something that pilots call QNH. QFE can also be useful and is the calibration to display actual height above the ground, basically setting the altimeter to read 0. To give an example, I'll show you the airport that I personally know the most about, Newcastle Airport in England. This airport is roughly 260 feet above sea level. If a pilot here wanted to calibrate their altimeter to read 260 feet, they would input the QNH into that barometric scale. If the pilot wanted their altimeter to display 0, they would input the QFE, which would be a considerably lower barometric reference. This works in the air too. It's common for pilots to adjust the altimeter setting in flight. Say there is a new weather report with a change in air pressure reported. Pilots adjust the altimeter accordingly for an accurate reading. In most of the world, the measurement to record air pressure on airplanes is known as hectopascal. This is a metric unit. HPA is pretty much the same as what one may already know as the millibar. They are the same unit. In the United States, because, of course, they use a completely different measurement of inches of mercury, a measurement that often needs to be converted. So when a pilot inputs the QNH, QFE, or what we're about to talk about next, they would input the hectopascal or inches of mercury measurement into that window. But we're still not done talking about altimeters. A barometer can only do so much. At high altitudes, the changes in air pressure on the ground become rather irrelevant. So at some point during the climb, pilots switch their altimeters over to what is known as standard pressure. As its name suggests, it's a global standard of pressure that has been agreed upon to be the sea level average atmospheric pressure. In hectopascal, this would be 1013, or 29.92 inches of mercury. Because the standard air pressure is rarely the same as that at ground or sea level, sometimes it is, but it is an average, this means that when a plane is, say, cruising at 30,000 feet, that's not exactly true. At higher altitudes, pilots and controllers use what are called flight levels, which are abbreviated thousands of feet based on the standard sea level pressure we've already discussed. So when we say our hypothetical plane is flying at 30,000 feet, to those in the know, this may be referred to as flight level 300, which technically is only roughly 30,000 feet. That is, if you were to actually measure it. But because every plane at cruising altitude should be tuned into that standard pressure, this doesn't really cause any problems in terms of traffic conflict. So, with all of that information, how did things go wrong on the Austrian Airlines Viscount on that one day in 1960? Basically, an incongruence between the captain and first officer's altimeters had emerged. When investigators later combed through the wreckage, they discovered that the two instruments were badly damaged in the accident. In fact, they were completely destroyed in the crash, including much of the internal mechanisms of the instruments themselves. Because of this, evidence was non-existent to suggest there was ever a mechanical problem with the altimeters. Despite the poor state of the altimeters, Austrian investigators were able to determine that both altimeters were actually sort of set correctly. However, there was still a large discrepancy between the two. A difference of 23 hectopascal or millibars was observed. This corresponded to a nearly 700-foot difference between the two instruments. The captain's side altimeter was set to 0990 millibars, whilst the co-pilot altimeter was set to 1013. Investigators believe that the possible explanation for this and possible causal factor in the crash was that the captain had set his altimeter to the QFE air pressure setting, so in theory it would indicate the actual altitude above the ground, whilst the co-pilot's was set on the QNH to read the altitude above sea level. To round it off, the elevation of Sheremetyevo Airport is nearly 700 feet above sea level. The plane flew too low and the pilot flying was unaware. The poor weather that night obscured much of the pilot's view outside. It is believed that they thought that they were flying on the correct approach path, supposedly backed up with radio transmissions between the plane and control tower. But the thing is, with the lack of a cockpit voice recorder, because this was 1960, investigators had no way to know if the pilots had actually misinterpreted their approach. Assuming that Captain Erwin Wilfing was the one flying the plane, his altimeter was displaying an altitude 700 feet lower than the co-pilot's instrument. You could imagine how, with such a discrepancy, that conflict would occur between the plane and the ground. From what one can gather, this is exactly what happened. When factoring in the tops of the trees, the plane was getting dangerously close to the ground. The Viscount plane descended well below the intended flight path and initially struck the tops of some trees west of the airport. An attempt was supposedly made to pull the plane up. However, significant damage had already been inflicted on the plane as the pilots were unable to climb. Seconds later, the plane crashed into the ground. The area the plane had crashed into was in a wooded region a few kilometers west of the runway at Sheremetyevo, near the town of Zelenograd. Of the 37 people on board, 31 were now dead, leaving 6 survivors. There were investigations that were conducted both by Austrian and Soviet investigators. A certain conspiracy sort of surfaced around this flight. Apparently, according to the writings of an Austrian journalist, an individual with connections to the KGB was booked onto the flight, but was sternly warned not to board the plane and to walk away from the airport in Vienna. The story goes the plane was supposedly carrying documents bound for the US Embassy in Moscow and was downed on the approach. Make of that what you will, as I don't wish to step into that sort of region with this video. Austrian Airlines, with this information, had determined that the pilots had deviated from standard practices. The pilots should have had their altimeters synchronized to read the same. It's right there in the checklists. The reasons as to why they might have done this are unknown. A big thanks once again to Blinkist for sponsoring this video. If you fancy checking out Blinkist, be sure to use my link below and get learning today. It's been a long while since we've had a sponsor. I think the last time I did one was back in November 2021. So it's been a long while now. Anyway, I would like to say that this is actually the first of 2 videos coming out this week. So if you like this video, be sure to be subscribed so you don't miss the next video coming at the usual time on Saturday. I would like to take a moment to thank my patrons over on Patreon for their amazing ongoing support. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now, so if you do see your name here, a massive thanks to you. If you yourself would like to support the channel further, you can join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from just £1 per month, and the link to that will be in the description below. If you didn't know, I also do have a personal Twitter page where I post things somewhat regularly. If you'd like to follow me on that, you can also find that in the description too. Anyway, that is all from me today, but like I said, there is another video coming on Saturday, so I'll see you then. Have a great evening and goodbye.